to, there we go, to my PowerPoint, which I will share for the next few minutes. Images and videos from my adventure kayaking the fjords of Norway. Can everybody see that? Raise your hand if you are muted, just to let me know you can hear me and see the images. Sounds good. Okay, let's begin. A little bit about me. I'm author of Paddle Pilgrim Kayaking the Fjords of Norway. In the Paddle Pilgrim series, there's a book on my Mississippi River journey, 2,300 miles down the Mississippi. I'm actually returning next month to paddle the headwaters. Turns out Ollie and I both have experiences in northern Minnesota and the boundary waters. That's where our paddling days began. Mine many years before Ollie, but nonetheless, that's holy water for me. I've taught courses at various colleges. You can see the lists of courses: a master gardener, Lutheran pastor, former distance runner, triathlete. And again, there's the website. So enough about me. Let's go to Norway. Where we paddled primarily were the Sonja or Sun Fjord and the Hardanger Fjords, which are near Bergen. You can see Bergen on the west coast, about, maybe a quarter of the way toward the North Cape, the north. And the two longest fjords, the Sun and Hardanger Fjords, we chose because those are the fjords that my ancestors came from when they came to America in the 1840s and 50s. So let me just close my window here so I'm not in your way. There we go. This is our team. Me on the left, Jim Lewis, who has paddled the whole Mississippi River and written about it. Ellen McDonough, who is the first woman to solo the Mississippi. She's also soloed the Missouri River. And Brent Bottomley, another Montana kayaker. All of us are retired. All of us are Norwegian in ancestry. And so when I invited them to go paddle the fjords of Norway, they said, "Ja, sure, you betcha." We launched from Gudvangen on the Narrow, which is Narrow Fjord, which is my favorite and a beautiful, beautiful fjord, from where we launched in our Inuit Liquid Logic roto-molded plastic kayaks that we rented from an outfit called Nordic Ventures. We could see 13 waterfalls. And one of the reasons we launched from here, besides getting decent equipment and a good rate, was we wanted to paddle in June, middle of June to the middle of July, because there was still a lot of snow in the mountains. And with the snow in the mountains, there's a lot of waterfalls, and that's spectacular. Here we are paddling up that fjord. You can see the first day was wet and cold, and we were kind of whining. And two young women on paddle boards who came in, greeted us, and they said, "Oh no, this is the best time to paddle because you paddle in the clouds and it's magical." And they were absolutely right. We camped the first night in a little hamlet called Lairdal, and just pulled up onto a rocky beach and had a great place to stay. You can see one of the kayaks there. This is Jim Lewis's red hammock. And Ellen, in addition to being a wonderful author, she's written a wonderful book on her Mississippi River journey called One Woman's River, is an artist. And so she's always sketching. And so this picture, she turned into that piece of art. And next month, Jim and Ellen and I will be heading to the boundary waters, and we'll be paddling 500 miles approximately from Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota to Minneapolis. And I know she'll have her sketch pad with her. Here's a little video to give you, this was sunrise on the Sun or Sonja Fjord. And listen to the birds. This was our first morning. Those birds were actually not happy. We realized that we had actually camped in their nesting area. And they were dive bombing us So we moved on to find a more hospitable place for not only us, but for the animals as well. As we went out for our first day, a little bit of a hike, we met Fjord Angels. I write in my books about the people you meet along the way and call them angels. And these two wonderful Norwegians, Bjarne and Randve, greeted us at their house. He grew up there and his family has farmed on this rocky shoreline since the 1600s. And they greeted us, welcomed us, and the town is named after his family, Lairdal. So we went hiking up a glacier-carved valley. Our trip was not just paddling, it involved some wonderful hikes into the mountains. And this path took us way up to the top by the glacier. When we got back from our hike, Randve had made the traditional heart-shaped waffles with strawberries and whipped cream. And if you're of Norwegian extraction, you'll recognize this is one of the delicacies. We headed out into fairly big water that first day. The wind was blowing and the waves were bouncing off of the rocky cliffs. Here's another little picture, a little video, giving you a little flavor. We are just leaving the Norway or Narrow Fjord, and we'll soon be turning down the Lairdal Fjord. But this gives you a little idea about paddling into the wind, which is a very common phenomenon in kayaking and in life as well. We paddled around that bend, and I was having difficulty, and water was getting into my spray skirt, and it turned out my rudder was broken. Our rental kayaks didn't have the best rudder systems, but fortunately we were able to contact the company and they replaced my kayak. And the first night after our first full day, we camped near the town of, it's spelled looking like Flam, but it's pronounced Flom, and it was in an old apple orchard. So there we are. It was rainy and it was cold and it was wet, and we hunkered down. But we decided to catch the electric train up into the mountains to Lairdal. The Norwegians and much of the rest of the world, particularly Europe, but the Scandinavians in particular, are so far ahead of us in terms of electronic and renewable technology. This train has been traveling with electric power, fueled by a waterfall you'll see in a minute, and it took us up into the mountains. Here's a little idea of what we saw outside the window. Waterfalls everywhere. This is the mountain waterfall, Sjossfossen, which actually has run that train for many, many, many years. And the spray from it and the roar of it is very, very powerful. We had to have our rain gear on simply because the water flowing into the air in the mist was so intense. We left the town of Flom and actually were transported by a different kayak company, Fjord kayaks, because the winds had come up, really strong winds, and so they transported us through the Lairdal Tunnel. This is the longest tunnel in the world. It's almost 25 miles long. The engineering in Norway is phenomenal. Because you travel so long and far in a tunnel, they paint the interior white, and they have turnouts at different places. So we turned out in the tunnel and stopped to get a quick picture. This gives you a little idea of the geography. You can see Gudvangen down here where we began, went up the Norway to Lairdal, around the Lairdal to Flom, and then up into the mountains to Lairdal. We were transported through Lairdal, this area right here, a tunnel across this fjord, Kaupanger Sogndal, which is Sun Valley is what it really is. That's where my great grandmother on my mother's side came from. We transported again and took a ferry across to the village of Balastrand, which you will now see some pictures of. The Sun Fjord at Balastrand. This is a famous village for artists because the light is so magnificent. Ellen, as the artist, when she looked out over the water, she asked us, how many shades of gray can you find? And when you can distinguish that many shades of gray, the artists are very, very happy. And so she was very happy to sketch and draw. The little harbor with some wooden sailing vessels. It was, again, cold at this point. We had to hold up for several days because of winds some days and rains other days. Now the weather was finally improving, so we hiked around. Here's a classic Norwegian farm with the farm in front with the orchard. Magnificent area. This is the St. Olaf Kirke, a faux Stav Church. The Stav Churches, I'm sure you've seen, and you'll probably see some more later in my presentation. This was just down the road from where we were camping. So we actually camped in a building. This was the only time we were in a building because the wind and the rain was so intense. We looked at our maps, we revised our plans. This is actually the group here, Jim and Ellen and I, will be paddling in another week on the Mississippi River. We stopped in a little restaurant in town and had some good cooking. This woman, Corolla, when we walked into the restaurant, we saw a sign on the door. It was actually with a picture of Rick Steves. Now, Rick is a good friend of mine. He lives a mile down the hill from us in Edmonds. And the story behind this was he had taken a tour group to Norway. He is of Norwegian extraction. And when he got to Balastrand, Corolla, this was maybe 10 years ago, who is from Austria, had a little sausage stand, and she made fresh sausage. And Rick fell in love with Corolla's sausage and wrote a very good review in his guidebooks, and it's still there. And she's done so well because of that free advertising that she was able to open this great restaurant. So I texted Rick with this picture with a Dankeschön from Corolla in Balastrand to Rick. This is the actual village, and a little paddling outside the village with the glacier up above. We stayed close to shore for a few days and just enjoyed being together because the weather had been wet and rainy, and now it's finally improving and we're ready to move on with our journey. This is the Vic-Ness Hotel, which is the great old wooden hotel. If you go to Norway and if you paddle, you can camp or you can go a little more top shelf or top drawer. And this is one of the examples of those great old wooden hotels on the fjords. So we took off and went on a little day journey up the Fjord. We actually rode the ferry with our kayaks on it up to the end of the fjord, and then paddled back to Balastrand. So you get an idea of the fjord and the mountain valleys and what the area is looking like. This is the little town and little church in Fjordland and the town of Mundal. The town of Mundal is where the late Senator and Vice President Fritz Mondale's people came from. And so I love to wander around in graveyards and see the history. And as you see on the bottom of this gravestone, the word tak. Tak in Norwegian is thank you. And I thought, what a lovely final word from a person after a life well lived. Well, it turns out as I wandered around, many of the gravestones had variations on that. Tak is thank you. Mange tak is many thanks. Tusen tak is 1,000 thanks. Hirkla tak is heartfelt thanks. So I took that to heart. So someday in my gravestone, if I have one, I'm hopefully going to end my life with a thank you. Right before we took off, the rain ended and there was a wonderful rainbow over one of the boathouses. You can see our kayaks down here in the town of Balastrand. Jim and Brent were kind of kibitzing down on the water. They didn't really want to get started. They wanted to wait for the tide to come and give them a little help. So they were joking. So I took a quick picture. You can get a little better idea of the kayaks that they were paddling in. So we headed across the Sun Fjord, a 9-mile reach. And as soon as we got on the water, it started to rain and started to blow. And they say in Norway, you can experience 4 seasons in a day. And this was another example of that. And we had quite a white knuckle paddle across the fjord because of the wind. It's also an area where you have to watch out for ocean going vessels because this is a major part of the fjord. Fortunately, we made it and got to the little village of Vik, V-I-K. And this is on the far side of the fjord. The word Vik means inlet. And so when you look at the word Viking, literally a Viking is a person of the inlet, a person of the water. And I like to think of the Viking as not the word Viking, not as a noun, but as a verb. You would actually say, we would go a Viking. We would go on a journey. And so for me and for many of us kayakers, the journey is what it's all about. So you probably have some of that Viking blood in you. Here's what the Stav Churches, these ancient churches from the 9th and 10th centuries, there's a few of them that remain, built completely without any kinds of regular nails, just dowels of wood, wonderful construction, a mix. You can see the Christian symbols up here of the cross. You can also see the pagan symbols of dragons. So they're an amazing combination architecturally and historically. So we went back to the Norwegian Fjord and found a wonderful camping area right along the fjord. You can see me kneeling by the kayaks, Ellen, all of us setting up our tents. We really found this to be a wonderful place to do day trips from. One day we hiked up along the fjord on the Norwegian Fjord to a waterfall. The 3 key words, the 3 F's in Norwegian, fossen, which means waterfall, fjord, which means body of water, and fjell, which means mountain. So if you ever have to take a quiz, you can get the 3 F's right. We hiked the other direction into the little town of Gudvangen, so you get an idea of the little tiny road that was on the far side of the fjord. And this is the little church in Bakka, and another graveyard for me to wander around in. If you grew up in the Midwest and on the prairies in the Dakotas or Wisconsin or Minnesota, very often you'd see these little white country churches, very much like the churches that the folks had back in Norway. This is a magnificent river, the Gudvangen, flowing into the fjord, well known all over Europe, particularly for its salmon fishing. One day, we were coming back in from a day paddle, and our beach had been invaded by a fleet of kayakers. Turns out they were people with handicapping conditions, and each of them in their tandem kayak had a Fjord Angel helping them, and they were on a 3-day camping expedition. And we were really inspired by this group of exceptional paddlers. And so Ellen presented our Spirit of Norway patch, which we designed, to Jan, who is their leader, and we thank them for visiting us. One of the unique features of life in Norway, there's a phrase called friluftsliv, and I think it's the key to the Scandinavian spirit. It's the key to why in almost every study that's done of the happiest people on earth or the most content people on earth, it's almost always the Scandinavian countries. And I think the reason is that all 4 seasons, Norwegians and Danes and Finns and Swedes are outdoors and they're breathing fresh air. And I live that to the lees. During the pandemic, every day, maybe I was putzing in my office and I was writing in the mornings, but every afternoon I was on my bike or I was in my kayak, or I was out walking. I wore out my knees from years of running. So I got outdoors, and this fresh air life is an understood sort of just basic value to people of the Nordic countries. Perhaps the most beautiful image was from our actual campsite. This was the first slide you saw at the beginning of the presentation. One evening we were sitting around a campfire, and the wind died down, and there was this absolutely magnificent reflection in the fjord right at our feet. And I was fortunate enough to get up and snap a quick photo. And there's Ellen's version of that fjord. As I've done presentations literally all over the country, people often comment and say, you know, it really looks like she was influenced by Van Gogh. And she's the first to admit that the lines and the movement and the kind of organic nature of her art is very often has a Van Gogh element. I'm looking forward to seeing her in 2 weeks and a week and a half when we paddle. She has a little dog, and her dog paddles with her most of the time. And her dog's name is Vincent Van Dog. So we moved from the Sun Fjord to now the Hardanger Fjord. We were transported by our kayak company. They were very good to load our kayaks. And we traveled to a little village you can see up here at the top of the map called Osa. The end of the road, not a tourist stop. There was a little dock there, but this is where we camped, and we got ready to head out on our first days on the Hardanger Fjord, where another wing of my family came from. We thought that we wouldn't really find many people around, but we went out for a walk the first morning, and guess what? We found a coffee shop. It was really one of only about 3 buildings, and an interesting former special forces operative who loved to climb and spelunk and paddle, actually bought a little land and has yurts and invites people to come to his place here on the end of the Hardanger Fjord in Osa and stay, and he takes them out on adventures. And our adventure that morning was to stop into his little coffee shop, and we had wonderful pancakes. They're more like what we would see as a crepe, and they had fresh jams and jellies from the berries that were picked from the local forest. So here we were. There's that picture you saw. Jim and Ellen and Brent and I. A big difference in these 2 fjords. This is further south. It's warmer. The mountains are more often covered with forests. There are more farms and orchards. And of course, my main reason for going to this fjord was to find my relative's farm further down the fjord, and you'll see that in just a little bit. We stopped in a little village called Ulvik, and I was just talking with a Norwegian friend of mine on the phone today, and I had lent her a book of poetry by Olaf Hauge. If you are into poetry, I encourage you to read the writings of Olaf Hauge. He was from this little village and writes magnificent poetry. I love to write poetry, and my mom was an English teacher, and I'm actually working on a book of poetry at the moment. And his poetry is very Scandinavian, a minimum of words, very rooted in the earth and in the land. And so we visited a little institute that studies his poetry, and we camped on an island in the middle of the harbor. We paddled into town. You'll see here just a little bit. You can see up on the hillside there, as Jim and Ellen take off, some farms and orchards. And I wanted to see what it was like. So when we got into town, and after we visited the Hauge Institute, or the Hauge Study Center, we went for a hike up the mountain. And here we were looking down at our island through an apple orchard. And so orchards, apples, there were actually cherries. We thought this was just the very best. And so we stopped in a little cafe on the top of the mountain, got some fresh Bing cherries, and had some frozen yogurt that was made from a local dairy farm and berries from the local fields. So it was fresh from the farm. A little further up that fjord, near Eide Fjord, we're paddling very close to the glacier, so you can see that glacial till in the water, and you can see the magnificent sculpture in the granite faces on the mountain. Occasionally, when we would come around a corner like this, we'd all come alongside each other and catch up with each other, and we'd play a game determining which historical figure or which animal or whoever would come up with a crazy idea, we'd see in the shapes carved into these rocks. We camped right by a waterfall once again, and we heard the tinkling of bells as we were fixing dinner, and two young goats joined us and became our friends. And of course, we had to name them Oli and Lena. This is one of my former students. She visited us in Eide Fjord, Katrina Nume. She's a teacher in one of the local schools, so she stopped by and had a chance to visit and catch up after a couple of years. Here's a shot on the Hardanger Fjord, approaching the fjord where my ancestors came from. You can see, even though it's now in July, you can still see a dusting of snow on top of the mountains. But warming days and magnificent weather, not windy, just the right kind of breezes. We turned around the corner into the Granvin Fjord, and this is the fjord my ancestors would have left when they came to America. So that we stayed there and camped. We would almost always camp near a boathouse or behind a boathouse because the weather can change very quickly, and we were protected. There was actually a little beach, and quite often kids would come down and swim in the icy water with not a second thought. They would just enjoy jumping and playing in the water, and we had a great place to camp. One morning, we found that the local hotel, a wonderful old hotel, had electric bikes. And they told us that if we got there early enough and if the patrons were not using the bikes, we could use them. And so we used them to go on our expedition out to find the family farm. But we got sidetracked by a fossen, lovely waterfall. And we stuck our feet in the water, had a little lunch on the way to the farm. Now, I'm not including, but I probably should have for this group. If I would have panned to the right, there was a clothing optional section to this particular waterfall. But we enjoyed just our little bit of time there and the cooling of our feet before we headed on to see the family farm. And here it is. My great grandmother on my dad's side was Helen Nesheim. And this is the family farm. The word in Norwegian is a gord. It looks like guard, but it's gord. And it was several hundred hectares or acres. And it has since been obviously broken up into many small little farms. But it was a very successful farm from about the 1500s on when the family began farming there. And here were my relatives, Erling and Helga Bruvik, and they greeted us, and we sat and chatted and looked in the family book and found my great grandfather, Johannes Olaf. He was known as Oli. I have three great grandfathers who were called Oli by different people. And this is my grandma Helen. And Olaf or Oli came to America in 1849, one of 14 children who came to Northeast Iowa to farm near Decorah, Iowa, and raised a family of 11 kids. And that's where my dad grew up, and a beautiful, beautiful hilly area where a lot of Norwegians came. At the very end of our time, before we were to return home, I looked out from our little camping area and the beach on this magnificent Granvin Fjord, and I thought, what a beautiful place. And I wonder what the relatives thought 170 plus years ago as they headed out and left this land that they loved for the new land. And of course, I put this one in because about 15 minutes later, the wind came up, the north wind. And there's a Norse proverb that says, the north wind created the Vikings. And so that was our experience on much of our journey. Beautiful, calm days, fierce, strong winds, and a true Viking experience. And here's the ancient mariner after a month of paddling. Here's our crew in Bergen with our wonderful little troll friend. We were spending a couple of days just relaxing after our journey and swapping tales, which have gotten better with each telling. So I leave you with a couple of quick thoughts, at least before we do our questions and answers. I love to say paddle boldly. You know, whatever we do, whether it's actually paddling or writing or teaching or camping, or I'm a grandfather now 5 times, and whether it's being a grandpa, whatever you do it boldly. Skål. This is my Paddle Pilgrim Kayaking the Fjords of Norway book. And again, my website, you can get to the books on this. My movie that I produced called Coming Home, which has been in a number of film festivals, is also there. 50 plus episodes of my podcast, which I created to help pass the time during the pandemic. Photo galleries with all my pictures, all sorts of good information at that website. And a final picture of all the books. The Mississippi River book is on the right. The Norway book is in the middle. And the third book was paddling the Erie Canal and the Hudson River to the Statue of Liberty. So I will stop at that point and stop the sharing and come back to the group. And I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. It's all yours, Ollie, if you want to moderate.
Well, maybe I'll start. A couple of questions came in through the chat as you were presenting.
Okay.
Let's see here.
I'm gonna open my.
Yeah. We had one that was just simply asking what year the trip was in. Dave, if you can still hear me.
I can still hear you. We paddled the fjords of Norway in 2018. So every couple of years, I try to do a major adventure because usually a book and a film come out of it, and then a lot of speaking. So it was 2018.
Another one was how canoeable as opposed to sea kayak would this trip be?
It would be fine. I mean, I began my water journeys in canoes. And of course, canoe technology from the old metal grummins to the canoes now, I would suggest if you're going to canoe it, that you have the gear along to protect you from the weather. I wouldn't just go out in an open canoe. Of course, with a kayak, you have your spray skirt and you have a lot more protection, but the technology, actually, Ellen is going to be paddling in a canoe this time on the Mississippi, and she showed me some pictures recently on the cover she has for her single person canoe. But it's interesting, on the Mississippi River just this week, 2 groups have been vying for the record in getting down the Mississippi River. They're both 4-person canoes, and the old record was about 18 days. And I think the one group is just finishing now. I haven't seen their time, but a new record's already been established of 17 days and 20 hours, of paddling 2,350 miles. And, if you're going to go that long, you need to have, because of the weather, you need to have good coverings, to keep yourself protected. So I think it's very canoeable.
Another one, Dave, is how much did you have to worry about tidal flows?
Of course, there are tides, but not significant. I think, and we were there during the solstice, so the moon has its biggest effect when there's a full moon around the time of the solstice. Of course, it's the land of the midnight sun, right? We didn't have much darkness. I think, at least as I would look at our beach or on the rocks, probably a 3-foot tide max. Now, of course, paddlers know almost instinctively, if not in their guts, as they're paddling. When they're paddling into the wind, there were a couple of situations where we were paddling into the wind and against the tide, and it slowed us down, obviously. But it wasn't significant. It wasn't a big problem. And generally speaking, the tide is not a huge flow, except at a few places where you're closer to the ocean and you're pinching between several rocky, narrow areas. There's actually some eddies and some whirlpools, not in these two fjords, that I've actually visited, that are, if you're a whitewater person, you would enjoy paddling through, because the tidal activity is pretty significant.
Well, anyone else who has any questions, feel free to unmute or throw them in the chat here. I guess I was wondering, is it correct to assume that the water was pretty icy?
It's interesting. I actually was checking both before, during, and after, and it's so similar to this area around Seattle. In July, the temperatures are in the mid 50s, which is pretty typical for the Puget Sound at that time. So, we had wetsuits, but to be perfectly honest, we didn't don them once. We probably should have. And the paddle club that I'm a member of, the North Sound Sea Kayakers out of Everett, for any paddle event, you have to have at least a wetsuit on. Summer, fall, winter, spring, and of course, if you have a dry suit, you wear that. But we were careful, and we're fortunate.
A couple other questions popped in. One is a request to tell us about Norwegian food and people.
Well, the Norwegian cuisine is not world renowned. The pastries, of course, we know with Denmark that the pastries are wonderful, and the way I like to describe it is, of course, there's a lot of fish in the diet, and the Norwegians don't have a lot of vegetables traditionally, but of course now with airlines and transportation, you can get anything you want. And with the globalization, you can find any kind of food in Norway. So it's really become very international. But Scandinavian cooking, other than I would say the desserts, is not famous. We brought along largely freeze-dried or dehydrated food and fixed it. Now, here's the secret. I was in a little shop one day, and I got by the dairy section. And I looked into the dairy case and just trying to pick out a few things to take back onto my kayak. And I saw a word that echoed from my grandmother's dining room table when I was growing up near St. Paul, Minnesota. If you're Scandinavian, you may know the word smør, SMO/R, smør, which means butter. And it's true in every way. Butter makes everything better. And so I got a large container of butter, and no matter what I cooked with my jet boil, my rice, my ramen, I don't care what it was, I put a dollop of smør in it, and it made it better. It didn't make it high-level cuisine, but it made it much better. Now, the Scandinavian people, there's kind of a stereotype of kind of the stoic, dour Scandinavians. And the joke, how can you tell an outgoing Norwegian? He looks at your shoes, right? And you have to think about that one for a second. But actually, they were very friendly, very outgoing, very hospitable. The Scandinavians require their kids and their young people to have 10 years of English. So they're all the people, except for maybe some of the very old people, are very fluent in English. Tourism is a very important industry, particularly on the fjords. So the people are very friendly and very outgoing, and we found them to be as welcoming as any place that I've traveled.
A couple other ones that have trickled in are, were you able to catch any fish or try catching them? And did you encounter many other paddlers on your trip?
We didn't try catching any fish, although we actually paddled by a couple of the fish farms, which is kind of a controversial subject in Norway. I used to teach environmental ethics, and one of the challenges, which is true not only there but true of fish farms here, is when you create a fish farm, you create a potential pollution problem because the fish have a way of leaving little deposits that get into the water, right? And rather than being spread out because the fish are swimming all over, they're all in one place. So we actually paddled by a few of the fish farms, and the aroma was pretty strong. But we didn't see a lot of paddlers. The kayak companies that we got to know would be taking groups out all the time, but typically they'd take them out for a day or 2 days or 3 days. The longest trips that the two companies that we worked with took groups out for were probably a week. But very good companies. They do a terrific job. We looked at the menus. You know, they gather around, and we were jealous. We wished that we ate as well as, but we didn't pay as much, and we were happy with our freeze dried, you know, with a dollop of smør.
Another question is, have you made any videos of your various paddling adventures on YouTube? I know some of them are on your website, so I'll put that link again in the chat, but are there any other spots?
Well, like I said, the coming home video has actually won some awards, and it's a 24-minute piece. It's on my website. I did a couple of short videos on my Erie Canal journey, and I produced a short video on my Mississippi River journey. And I'm actually working with a drone pilot right now back in Minnesota out of Bemidji, and he's going to be shooting us as we're paddling through the marshes and the really remote areas so that people can get a better idea. In fact, we just posted just the other day a minute on the first page of my website in the news. Taylor Anderson is his name, shot and gave a sample of kind of that area of northern Minnesota. So I'm going to produce another film on the Mississippi River journey, and so in addition to writing a book, I'll also be producing a film, and that should be done by the end of the year, I hope.
Any other questions, comments, either through the chat or feel free to unmute?
Just want to say thank you. This was really, really enjoyable to watch.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun to, as they would say in Norway, tusen takk, vel bekomme.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks,
You're
Dave.
welcome.
I really enjoyed the cultural component of it too. I think that's made this talk a little bit more unique. So thanks for doing this.
The cultural part. It
Definitely.
really made it interesting, more interesting.
Yeah.
My pleasure. And if you go to my website and if you have any follow-up questions, I mean, I'm a retired pastor professor. And so, you know, I get people emailing me all the time asking about, I mean, like I helped to create the Erie Canal Paddlers Group. And now it has over 1,000 people who are paddling on the Erie Canal. And part of the reason I did it is I just love that area of northern New York. I grew up part of my life in northern New York, but it's also a very depressed area economically. And part of the reason is I'm trying to help that area attract tourists to support these little beautiful historic towns along the Erie Canal. So if you have questions about the Erie Canal or the Norway trip or the Mississippi River trip or any of those journeys, feel free just to email me. All that information is on my website.
Great.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave. Again, this recording, we can put it on YouTube if anybody wants to spread it around. And thanks everybody for coming. Have a great night.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Ollie. Take care. Paddle boldly.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.